Welcome to my ultimate ring muscle up tutorial, where I'll teach you everything you need to know to master the ring muscle up. What is a muscle up? It's the move I just did, and it's a combination of a chin up, a dip, and the false grip. And then another thing called the transition, which I'll get into a little bit later, which is the portion between the chin up and the dip. It's also how we're going to get on top of the rings to start some type of ring flow, or maybe you just want to do the muscle up because it's super cool. It is also an expression of shoulder extension, which is the ability to get our elbows to move behind us like this and our shoulders to move this way. First thing I want to talk about is the rings. So the rings are going to be inherently unstable, so you want to make sure that you start training on them right away. It's not going to really stop you from doing pulling stuff like rows or chin-ups, but a lot of the pushing skills get super unstable on the rings, so you want to just get used to training on the rings and doing stuff on the rings right away, which I'll kind of move into a little bit later on. In terms of what type of rings that you want to get, you want to be looking for 28 millimeter rings, not the 32 ones, unless you're doing this for CrossFit, but I recommend 28 because it'll just be a little bit easier to do a lot of the gripping stuff when the rings are a little bit smaller, like doing things like false grip and chin-ups, and a lot of the pulling stuff will be a bit easier on the smaller rings. The first thing I want to talk about is how to warm up. The best way to warm up would be just doing regressions of the things we know we need for a muscle up. So we know we need chin-ups, so maybe you do something like a regress chin-up. An example of a regress chin-up would be something like this, like an assisted chin-up, for example, where you're using your feet to assist you going through the full range of motion of a chin-up, or maybe you're doing eccentric chin-ups, where you're starting from the top and you're slowly lowering all the way down, or depending what level you're at, you can even do complete full chin-ups just to warm up. Then I would suggest you do the same exact thing with dips. So we know we're going to be doing dips, so maybe starting with something like feet assisted dips, where the feet can take the load out of the movement and you can just work on the movement pattern, or you can do eccentrics, where you're just slowly lowering down, and depending how advanced you are, you can even just do regular dips on the rings. To warm up the shoulder extension portion of the muscle up, a great way to do that is with stick dislocates. That sounds scary, but it's not that bad. You're going to grab a stick or a towel, and you're going to grab it by the ends of the stick or towel. You want to make sure you start wide, because the narrower you go, the harder it is, and the difficulty scales really fast. So always just start as wide as you can, and then you're going to think about keeping the ribs braced down as much as possible as you're going through this movement, and you're just bringing the stick all the way back behind you, keeping the elbows locked out and not rushing through any sticking points as you make your way around with the stick.
The really great warm-up to invest some time into is the German hang, especially if you're someone who has trouble at the bottom of the dip, creakiness, or not enough flexibility in the shoulders to get all the way down there. The German hang is going to stretch exact muscles that are being stretched at the bottom of the dip, except in a little bit more intense way, because the arms are going to be straight rather than bent. This is what the German hang looks like. In order to get into the German hang, you need to be able to transition the rings behind you. If you put too much weight into the rings as you're transitioning the rings from in front of you to behind you, it can really hurt your shoulders. So just keep that in mind when you're going from here to here. Don't put any weight into the rings when you're doing that. Make sure the weight is in your feet so that you can easily and comfortably transition the rings behind you. That's the first step. The next step is you just start slowly lowering your hips down towards the floor, and as you do that, you'll start feeling more and more of a stretch in your chest, maybe your biceps, the fronts of your shoulders. Over time, you want to start slowly loading that position up by slowly taking more and more weight out of the feet and putting more and more weight into the rings, and that'll start getting you more flexible and more prepared for the bottom of the dip. I would do 20 to 30 second holds, maybe up to a minute, with the feet supported on the floor. As you increase the intensity by taking more and more weight out of your feet and putting more and more weight into the rings, you can decrease the amount of time that you're holding it. You could build up to I wouldn't say it's a prerequisite, but building up to being able to hold yourself up without having the feet on the floor for 10 plus seconds will definitely be more than enough flexibility and strength to transfer over to having really good deep dips.
We also know we're going to be doing a false grip, which I'll explain in a second. But a great way to warm up the false grip is by doing this Drunken Master Kung Fu Ninja push-up. I don't know what exactly the name is, as you can see. So what you're going to do is you're going to fist bump yourself. You're going to get the back of the hands on the floor, and then keeping the fists touching without the fingers uncurling or losing any space between the fingers. You're going to try to strain your elbows as much as possible, and you should feel a really huge stretch in the backs of your forearms and in the backs of your hands. And then you're just dropping the elbows down, trying to strain the elbows as much as possible. Oh, this one can be pretty intense, so if you can't strain the elbows out all the way, totally fine. This is a great warm-up for the false grip because once you start doing it, you'll notice it's super uncomfortable and your forearm extensors are lacking the flexibility to be in this really funky wrist position. So this is a great way to get your forearms and wrists used to being in this extremely flexed position and get comfortable there. Something to then start incorporating in your warm-up right away is doing something called the top support. This is going to teach you how to stabilize yourself on the rings and get you much more comfortable working on them, especially with pushing skills like the dip. Top support, the full top support looks like this. You're able to support your weight on top of the rings without it being too shaky, and you can lift your feet off the floor. The way you're going to build up to being able to do that is just by taking more and more weight out of your feet and putting more and more weight into your hands. And so the first time you do this, if you haven't worked on rings, you'll notice you're going to be like super shaky and be like, oh my God. Just over time, with every session that you do, try to just take a little bit more weight out of your feet and put more weight into the hands. Some tips for this is you want to make sure your elbows stay completely locked out the entire time. And also keep the rings as close as you can to your body. The further the rings move away from your body, the more unstable and the more loaded things start to get. So just make sure that you keep the rings super close to your body, elbows locked out, and then over time you'll notice it'll get easier and easier to take more weight out of your feet and put more weight into your hands. So next thing I want to talk about is the false grip. So what is the false grip? Essentially what it is a different type of grip on the rings that allows you to get this part of your wrist on top of the rings. So when you're going from top of chin up to bottom of dip, you don't need to transition your hands on top of the rings because they're already set there. So this is what the false grip looks like. You can see that it looks kind of like I have more of my hand on top of the ring, and that's just going to allow us to much more easily transfer our weight from underneath the rings to on top of the rings without having to shift our hand at all. It's a very uncomfortable grip to start. You're going to get into the false grip. The easiest way that I found is you're going to grab the top of the rings with your palms facing the sky, and then from there you're just transitioning the palms facing down, and you should notice that you can kind of get this part of your wrist on top of the rings, and now you're in your false grip, and your goal is to never lose this. Do not lose the false grip. The way that you're going to progress the false grip, the first progression I would start working on is false grip rows. It's very easy to change the intensity of this just depending on where you're standing in relation to the rings. Further back that I am, I don't want to walk in these weeds, so I'm not going to go all the way back. But the further back that I am and less parallel with the floor, the easier it's going to be for me to do the false grip row. The more parallel that I begin to get with the floor, the more loaded it's going to be on the false grip and the harder it's going to be. So when you're doing these, make sure that you always get the rings to touch your chest. And then another thing is always make sure you're staying in the false grip because, that's the point. The next progression that I'd begin to work on once you've built up the false grip rows comfortably and they're feeling good is the false grip hang. So now you're going to be loading up the false grip a lot more, and it's going to be the beginnings of building up to a false grip chin up. So you're just maintaining your false grip and going for a hang. Once you've built that up to maybe over 10, 20 seconds, you'd want to start loading it a little bit more by doing false grip knee raises. So now maintaining the false grip, you're driving the knees up towards the chest, and as the knees move up towards the chest, it starts loading up the hands a little bit more when the knees are as high as possible. And then once you can comfortably do chin-ups without the false grip, and you've built the false grip up to doing some knee raises, you should be able to do false grip chin-ups, which is going to be the first prerequisite of doing the muscle up. Maintaining the false grip, you can pull the rings to your chest and you don't lose it. The perfect segue is talking about the next prerequisite, which is being able to do chin-ups, false grip chin-ups. I'm not going to get into how to build the chin-up in this video because it'll be a lot longer than I'd like, but some non-negotiables for when you're developing the chin-up for the muscle-up is you need to make sure that when you're doing your chin-ups, whatever progression you're working on in order to get your chin-up, is pulling the rings to your chest. The higher that you can pull in your chin-up, the easier it's going to be for you to transition from top of chin-up to bottom of dip. So if you're not pulling high enough, it's going to be really hard for you to transition from below the rings to on top of the rings. Always make sure that you're touching the rings to your chest and you're looking to build up to 5. At first, it can be pretty hard on the elbows and your biceps when you're starting off pulling that high, but over time, you'll start to get used to it and it's going to pay dividends in you getting your first muscle up. The next prerequisite that we're going to talk about is the dip. Pushing on the rings is always going to be a lot more unstable than pulling, and it's going to be a little bit harder. Just like the chin-up, I'm not going to get into the progressions of how to build dips on the rings, but you're looking to build up to 5 to 6 deep dips. Just like the chin-up, the higher that you can pull, the easier it's going to be to transition through to the dip, and the deeper that you can get in your dip, the easier it's going to be to transition there from the top of the chin-up. So the stronger you are at the bottom of a deep dip, the easier it's going to be to transition there from the top of the chin-up. The prerequisite of the dip is shoulder extension, because you need to be able to get your arms back behind you pretty well in order to get deep into the dip. In terms of how deep in the dip you should be looking to get, I would say the deeper the better. A good place to start is trying to get the rings to touch your chest. That will show me that you're going pretty deep in the dip. Some people's shoulders can be kind of creaky with dips, especially as they start to go deeper. I would just build the depth over time if you're someone who has a little creakiness in the shoulders with dips. Maybe you start with doing 5 reps where your upper arm is getting parallel with the floor, and then as you build the strength there, you start to take it a little bit deeper, and just build the depth over time and don't rush going super deep into the dip. Because we're going to be doing a lot of loaded shoulder extension, I think a great accessory to start working on in conjunction with all this other stuff is working on your active shoulder extension. Since you're always going to be loading your shoulder extensors at the bottom of the dip all the time, it's also great to be able to pull yourself into that position. Something that I would work on in order to do that is stick lifts. So you need to grab a stick, and your goal is going to be building up to getting the stick parallel with the floor. Now you're actually actively strong in that position, so you want to be building up to 5 deep dips. The next step of the muscle up, and usually the most difficult part for people, is the transition. The transition is the movement in between the top of the chin up and the bottom of the dip. It's a movement that you need to understand how to do properly, and it's also a movement that you need to be strong in. I'm going to show you how to learn this movement, and then I'm going to show you how to load it so you can get stronger through it. You're going to need to get into a false grip, and you want to set the height of the rings so that the bottom of the ring is at about armpit height. This drill is going to be the base of how we're going to start loading the transition. Make sure you really understand how to do the transition. So the first progression we're going to work on is just learning how to coordinate the transition using your feet as assistance, just like how we did with the top support. When you're practicing the transition, you want to break it up into 3 distinct phases. And then also you want to make sure that you're in your false grip the entire time when doing this. Phase 1 is you're pulling the rings to your chest. So you'll notice my spine is in a little bit more of an extended position rather than a neutral or flex position. So the phase one is being here, rings touching the chest and the spine in a more extended position. The next step is keeping the elbows as close as you can towards the body and keeping the thumbs in contact with the chest the entire time as you go from top of chin up to bottom of the dip, and you want to make sure that you punch your chest through enough so that you get the elbows stacked on top of the wrists. If you don't get the elbows stacked on top of the wrists, it's going to be extremely hard to push out of the dip at the bottom. So you can see this is like almost like I'm doing a bodyweight tricep extension to push out of the dip versus getting the elbows on top of the wrists. It's going to be much easier to push myself up out of the bottom of the dip. So that's phase 2. And then phase 3 is just reversing this movement. So you're going to do the same exact thing you just did, except in reverse. Elbows stay as close as you can to the body. Thumbs stay in contact with the chest. And you're transitioning back to the top of the chin up. So that's how to coordinate the transition. Now we're going to load it up. The 2 best ways that I found to load it up are 1, just like the top support, taking more weight out of the feet and putting more weight into the rings. So now you're doing the same thing, except you're loading it. You still want to try to break it up into phases. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And you don't want to be able to do more than 5 reps. Otherwise, you're not loading it up enough. Another great way to load it up is just by starting kneeling and having the bottom and having the tops of your feet against the floor. This way you won't be able to actually push your feet into the floor much to give yourself assistance. So now you're doing the same thing, except you'll notice now your feet literally cannot assist you as much as when they're flat on the floor. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. 1, 2, 3. And that will be how you start loading the transition. Once you've built up to these prerequisites, 5 false grip chin-ups where the rings can touch your chest, 5 deep dips, a really good execution of the transition, and a strong transition. So you start loading it up and you've done that for a while. Now the final step is doing an eccentric muscle up. If you have access to a partner, it's really good to practice this the first time with a partner. If you don't have a partner, just be mindful when doing this that it can be difficult. And if you feel like it's still pretty inaccessible to you, then you just need to build up those prerequisites that I mentioned right now a little bit more. But do not try to do this until you've built up to those prerequisites. Don't just be like, oh, I can do 1 dip and 1 chin up, I'm going to try a muscle up eccentric. No. Try to really build up these prerequisites before attempting this. An eccentric is just the lowering portion of the movement. You're just going to start at the top of the muscle up versus at the bottom. So you're starting in your top support. You're lowering yourself down into the deep dip. And then from the deep dip, you're trying to control yourself as best you can into the top of the chin up, and then lowering yourself all the way down. If you can do 2 to 3 controlled eccentric muscle ups, you should be able to do a full muscle up. Once you can do 2 in a row without dropping too much through the transition, you can start sending it on doing the actual muscle up, and you should be able to get it relatively soon, or if not, within that session or a couple sessions. If you feel like the eccentric muscle up is still inaccessible, you just need to go back and build up those prerequisites that I mentioned, the dips, chin-ups, transition, more, and then you should be able to get it very, very soon. In terms of how much you should be training, I would say 2 sessions a week is a really good place to start. You could build up to 3, even 4 sessions if you'd like. I wouldn't do more than 4 sessions a week. I think 4 is probably even on the higher side of how much you could be training muscle ups. Between 2 to 4 sessions a week is a great place to start. If you like this video and you want me to make some tutorials on how to progress things like the chin up and dip, let me know in the comment section below. That's basically everything you need to know on how to achieve the muscle up. I hope you enjoyed. Subscribe, like, do all that stuff. And hope you like this nice view. Yeah. All right, goodbye.